In this session, we just introduced different categories of constraints. Constraints can be categorized based on what kind of constraints it is. Okay, so the constraints can be on instances, on objects. For example, we can specify how a pair or a set of instances, those objects, should be grouped in the cluster analysis. Usually, the most typical ones are must-link versus cannot link constraints. Must link of x and y means the objects x and y must be grouped together into one cluster in your cluster analysis. For example, you can think these two orange colored objects. Once we say must link, that means in your final in your cluster analysis, when you try to form clusters, these two objects should be in the same cluster. Constraints also can be defined using variables. For example, you can say cannot link of x, y if the distance of x and y is greater than the predefined distance d. Okay. For example, you can say these two objects, different colors. One is a point of orange color, the other is blue color. If we say these two objects cannot be linked together, simply says you can say these two objects should be in different clusters. But once you specify these constraints, you basically say any kind of objects, x and y, if their distance is greater than d, then cannot link. Simply say they cannot be linked together. Okay. The constraints on clusters means you want to specify requirement of the clusters. That means finally, when you form clusters, what the cluster should satisfy. Okay. For example, you may specify a minimum number of objects in the cluster. Simply says this cluster must contain at least, say, 100 objects. The maximum diameter of a cluster simply says this cluster, the diameter cannot be over, say, 100. The shape of cluster, for example, the cluster must be in the shape of convex. The number of cluster, for example, the k. Also, the constraints can be on distance measures. That means we can specify requirement, the distance calculation, distance function. Distance calculation must respect such a constraints. For example, we can say when you're thinking about households, when you set up delivery centers, you can say the cars must be driving on roads when you calculate the distance. And they must observe obstacles. That means it cannot cross rivers and lakes using Euclidean distance. They have to thinking about cross bridges or go around. Okay. So these are the popular used different categories of constraints.